The black dress was the first thing Edgar Conroy noticed about her, and the silence was the second. She stood in the middle of Redemption Creek's Main Street on a Tuesday in September of 1878, a worn leather trunk at her feet, her dark hair pinned so severely beneath a charcoal bonnet that it seemed to be holding her skull together. Around her, the town moved and breathed and creaked in the dry afternoon heat, boots thudding on the boardwalk, horses snorting at the hitching posts, the blacksmith's hammer ringing out its steady iron gospel. But the woman in the black dress existed in a pocket of absolute stillness, as though the world had agreed not to touch her. Edgar had stopped his wagon midway across the street. He did not know why. He had driven that stretch of road 1,000 times. His horses, Duke and Mabel, had the route memorized in their muscles. But something in the way that woman stood, something in the particular quality of her stillness, pulled at a place behind his sternum that he hadn't thought about in years. She turned, and he saw her face. It was the face of someone who had used up every last reserve of grief and was now running on the hollow calm that came after. Her eyes were dark and wide and dry. No tears. He would learn later that she had cried herself into a kind of numbness on the 3-week journey from Virginia, that by the time the stagecoach dropped her here in this sun-scorched territory, she had wrung herself so completely that she felt transparent, like a woman made of window glass standing in a town that barely knew it existed. Her name was Rosa Quinn, and her husband had been dead for 6 weeks. Edgar would not know that yet. He would not know about Thomas Quinn, or the fever that took him in 17 devastating days, or the debts that came after like a second death. He would not know about the letter she'd found in Thomas's coat pocket, the hidden truth that had cracked the floor of her grief and revealed something darker and more complicated underneath. He would not know any of it in this moment. He only knew that she looked like a woman who had been extinguished, and that something about it was unbearable to witness. He climbed down from the wagon before he understood he had made a decision. The September sun hit the back of his neck like a brand. He was a tall man, Edgar Conroy, broad through the shoulders and lean everywhere else, with calloused hands and a face that the territory had worked on the way weather works on good wood. He was 34 years old and had been running the Conroy cattle operation alone for 2 years since his father's passing, and the solitude had settled into him like a second skeleton. He was not a man given to impulsive gestures. He crossed the street anyway. She didn't look at him as he approached. She was staring at a paper in her hand, some kind of address, her brow drawn together with the effort of matching what was written to what surrounded her. "You need help finding something?" he asked. She looked up then, and he saw it up close, the exhaustion. The quiet devastation behind those dark eyes, carefully contained, the way you contain a fire by building walls around it and hoping the walls hold. "I'm looking for a widow woman named Mrs. Caldwell," Rosa Quinn said. "She was a friend of my mother's. She offered me a room." "Agnes Caldwell runs the boarding house on Sycamore," Edgar said. "2 streets east, the yellow building." "Thank you." She bent to pick up the trunk. "I'll carry that for you." She looked at him with a measuring quality, the look of a woman who had learned to assess strangers quickly and trust them slowly. Then she straightened and said, "I'm fine, thank you. It's heavy. I can see it's heavy from the way you're angling your shoulder." "Sir, I don't know you." "Edgar Conroy. I run cattle about 5 miles north of town. My father built this town's first water trough. My mother taught Sunday school here for 20 years. Agnes Caldwell would vouch for me." A silence stretched. The town went on around them. A dog barked somewhere distant. "Rosa Quinn," she said at last, and did not extend her hand. He picked up the trunk. It was indeed heavy. They walked the 2 streets east in silence, and that silence was one of the more honest things Edgar Conroy had experienced in some time. Agnes Caldwell was a woman constructed of practicality and warmth in roughly equal measure, with white hair and quick brown eyes that took in Rosa's black dress and Edgar's presence at her door, and drew a complex and mostly accurate set of conclusions in about 3 seconds flat. "Rosa Quinn," she said, pulling the younger woman into an embrace that brooked no argument. "You look like you've been through the thresher, child. Come in. I have coffee and there's a room ready." Edgar set the trunk inside the door. Agnes Caldwell looked at him with those quick brown eyes and gave him a nod that meant she recognized the nature of what had just occurred, even if he hadn't named it to himself yet. He walked back to his wagon and drove north toward his cattle and his empty house, and he did not think about Rosa Quinn. This was a lie he told himself for approximately 4 days. The cattle operation Edgar ran was not glamorous. It was approximately 4,000 acres of dry grass and scrub, 1,200 head of longhorn cattle, a bunkhouse with 6 hired hands, and a main house that his father had built with more ambition than resources, resulting in a structure that was large, drafty, and in a state of constant negotiation with the elements. Edgar had grown up in that house, and when his father died and left it to him, he'd rattled around in it like the last bean in a tin, aware of all the space he didn't fill. He was a man who worked from first light to full dark and fell asleep in the chair by the fire more often than in the bed upstairs. And this was not a complaint so much as a description of a life that had contracted itself around work after his father's death, and then contracted further still after the other thing he did not think about. The thing involving a woman named Cecilia who had said she would wait and then had not waited, who had married a banker in Santa Fe and sent a brief letter that Edgar still had somewhere he couldn't find and wouldn't look for. He did not think about Cecilia much. He did not think about the empty chair at the supper table or the particular quality of silence in a house that had once held a family. He was a practical man with practical concerns, and he had long ago established that thinking about what was absent did not fill the absence. Then he thought about Rosa Quinn. He thought about her because on the 4th day he drove into Redemption Creek for supplies and he saw her at the mercantile, and she was buying flour and coffee and a length of gray fabric. And when Mrs. Tillman, the shopkeeper, made some remark about the weather that was clearly an attempt to draw her out, Rosa Quinn responded with polite, minimal answers that closed every conversational door before it could open. She was, Edgar recognized, doing what he did. She was keeping everything at a distance because distance was the only thing between her and something she couldn't survive touching yet. He bought his supplies. He did not speak to her. He drove home. On the 6th day he drove into town again, which was not something he had any practical reason to do, and told himself he needed to stop at the farrier's, which was true, though the need was not urgent. He found Rosa Quinn sitting on the bench outside the boarding house, and she was not crying, but she was holding a small dried flower in her palm and looking at it with the kind of concentrated focus that was really about something else entirely. He stopped and sat beside her without quite planning to. "How are you settling in?" he asked. She closed her hand around the flower. "Well enough. Agnes treating you right. She's very kind. She keeps feeding me." "She fed half the territory through the drought of '73, Edgar said. "It's her primary response to any problem." Something shifted in Rose's expression. Not quite a smile. The ghost of a smile's skeleton. "What are you doing in town?" she asked. "Farrier. My horse picked up a stone bruise." She nodded, and they sat in a quiet that was not comfortable exactly, but was not uncomfortable either. It was the quiet of two people who understood that words cost something and so did not spend them carelessly. "I need to find work," she said suddenly, as though the words had been building pressure. "What kind of work can you do?" She turned to look at him directly for the first time, and he noticed that her eyes were not quite black as he'd first thought, but a very dark brown, almost amber at the very center. "I can cook, keep accounts. I can read and write well. I kept my husband's books for 3 years. A brief shadow crossed her face at the mention of the husband. "I can do most things that need doing." "There's not much call for bookkeeping in Redemption Creek," Edgar said, "but Mrs. Tillman at the mercantile might take on a counter girl. The schoolteacher position is empty, the last one left in June." "I don't have a teaching certificate." "This is the New Mexico Territory in 1878, Mrs. Quinn." The standard requirements are somewhat relaxed. That ghost of a skeleton of a smile appeared again, slightly more substantial this time. "I'll speak to the school board," she said. "I know the school board chairman," Edgar said. "His name is Hiram Foster, and he is approximately as immovable as a sandstone ridge, but he respects directness. Go to him first thing in the morning, look him in the eye, and tell him exactly what you're capable of. Don't soften it." She was quiet for a moment. "Why are you helping me?" The question was direct and deserved a direct answer. He thought about it honestly. "You look like you could use a hand," he said. "And I'm not in the habit of watching someone struggle with something I can fix." She studied him with those amber-dark eyes. He could see her assessing, measuring, deciding something about his character. "Thank you, Mr. Conroy," she said. "Truly." He nodded and stood and tipped his hat and went to the farrier. And on the way home he was aware that something in the contracted interior of his life had shifted a fraction of an inch, like a window opening just slightly, letting in a thread of different air. Rosa went to Hiram Foster the next morning at 7 o'clock, while he was still eating breakfast, and she looked him in the eye and told him exactly what she was capable of with such unvarnished precision that he hired her to teach the town's 11 children before his coffee had cooled. She began the following Monday. Edgar heard this from Agnes Caldwell, who told him because she knew things the way the sky knows weather, instinctively and in advance. "She's a strong one," Agnes said, pouring him coffee in her kitchen. "Different kind of strong than she used to be, I think, but strong." "What was she before?" Edgar asked, because he was not thinking about Rosa Quinn but apparently couldn't stop asking about her. "Her mother wrote me about the marriage." Thomas Quinn was a gentleman from a Richmond family, educated, well-regarded. She loved him quite genuinely, I believe. Agnes set down the coffee pot with a measured care that said she was choosing her next words. "But there's something she's not telling me about how he died, something beyond the grief." Edgar held his coffee and looked out Agnes's kitchen window at the bright, hard September sky. "It's not my business," he said. "No," Agnes agreed, with the serenity of a woman who knew perfectly well that this was exactly the sort of thing that would eventually become his business. Rosa Quinn threw herself into teaching the way she threw herself into everything now, which was with a complete, almost furious competence, because doing things fully and correctly was the only way she knew to keep the darkness at bay. She organized the schoolroom, wrote to the Territorial Education Office for textbooks, established a routine, and proceeded to educate 11 children in subjects ranging from arithmetic to geography to the rudiments of American history, with a thoroughness that had Hiram Foster quietly impressed and the children quietly terrified in the most productive possible way. She still wore black. In 1878, the proper mourning period for a widow was 2 years for the deepest mourning, followed by a gradual lightening. Black bombazine, black crepe, black everything. No ornament. Rosa adhered to this with the rigor of someone for whom external rules were a useful frame when the internal ones had been shaken loose. The black dress was not just grief, though it was grief. It was also a container. It was also an armor. What she did not tell Agnes Caldwell, what she had not told anyone, was what she had found in Thomas's coat pocket on the day they returned from burying him. A letter. From a woman in Charleston. Not a simple letter. A letter of a particular and devastating kind. The kind that revealed a correspondence spanning 2 years. The kind that made clear that the man she had married and the man she had believed she was married to were separated by a significant and unbridgeable gap. The letter spoke of love and of plans and of waiting, and it was addressed to Thomas in a way that made Rosa's chest feel as though someone had pressed a brand against the inside of her sternum. She had burned it. She had told no one. She was not sure which grief was worse, the one for Thomas's death or the one for the Thomas she thought she'd known, and the uncertainty of that was the most corrosive thing she'd ever carried, because it meant she couldn't even trust the grief itself, couldn't trust that what she was mourning was real. She taught arithmetic. She taught geography. She corrected spelling with a focused, merciless patience. And on Friday afternoons, after the children went home, she sat in the empty schoolroom for exactly 15 minutes and allowed herself to feel whatever was inside her before she sealed it back up and walked back to Agnes's boarding house. On the third Friday, Edgar Conroy appeared in the doorway of the schoolroom. He had a small bunch of wildflowers in his hand. They were yellow, vivid in the slant of afternoon light, some kind of prairie composite she didn't know the name of. He was holding them as though he was not entirely sure how he had come to be holding them. She looked at him and then at the flowers. "My housekeeper, Maria, says you should have something that isn't black," he said. "She sent these. She insisted. Your housekeeper. She's a persuasive woman. I was outvoted." Rosa looked at the flowers for a long moment. Yellow. The color seemed almost aggressive to her, after weeks of gray and black and the dust brown of the territory. "Tell Maria thank you," she said, and took them. She put them in a tin cup with water on the schoolroom windowsill, and she did not examine why her hands were not entirely steady as she arranged them. That evening she wrote a letter to her sister in Virginia, the first she'd written since arriving, and said that New Mexico was drier than she'd expected, and the children were challenging, and the sky was enormous. She did not write that a cattleman had brought her wildflowers. She did not write that the yellow of them had seemed, for a single dislocating moment, like light appearing in a room that had been dark for weeks. Edgar's housekeeper, Maria, was a Mexican woman in her mid-50s who had cooked and cleaned, and largely governed the Conroy household since Edgar's mother passed in 1871. She was small, decisive, and radically perceptive. And when Edgar came home the following Monday after what he claimed was a routine supply run, and Maria noticed that he had forgotten the coffee she'd specifically asked him to get, but had somehow brought back a length of good blue fabric from the dry goods store, she said nothing. She simply made a mental note and began revising her understanding of her employer's interior life. Edgar left the blue fabric on the kitchen table and went out to check the cattle, and Maria folded it carefully and thought about the widow woman in town that Agnes Caldwell had mentioned in passing the last time she'd come for her quarterly visit. The next week, Edgar found an excuse to repair the fence on his southern boundary, which happened to put him on the road to Redemption Creek on a Tuesday afternoon, and he happened to pass the schoolhouse just as Rosa Quinn was hanging a water-stained geography map on the exterior wall with an expression of focused irritation. "The nail keeps pulling out," she said, without looking down to see who had stopped. "The wood's dry-rotted," Edgar said, looking up at her from where she was balanced on a stool. "You'll need to go about 2 inches to the left to hit the good grain." She moved the nail. The hammer struck true. The map held. She climbed down and looked at the map critically. "Better. What you need is new clapboard on that whole section," he said. "I could bring some timber next week. The school board should fund the repair, but they won't move fast." "How do you know they won't move fast?" "I'm on the school board," he said. She looked at him. "You said Hiram Foster was the chairman." "He is. I'm a member. I voted to hire you." She was quiet for a moment, recalibrating this information. "Thank you," she said, with a slight addition of weight that suggested she was thanking him for more than the vote. He brought the timber on Thursday morning, and he and one of his hands, a quiet young Mexican man named Benito, repaired the exterior wall while Rosa taught the children inside. She brought them both coffee mid-morning, and Edgar noticed that she'd brought 3 cups but poured her own without looking, which meant she'd planned ahead, which meant she'd expected the gesture, which meant she was, in some small and careful way, leaving the door open. In October the nights turned cold fast, the way they did on the high desert, and Rosa wrapped herself in a black wool shawl she'd brought from Virginia and walked to school in the thin early morning light with her breath coming out in brief white clouds. The walk was 20 minutes from Agnes's boarding house, past the livery and the general store and the small adobe church, and she had the streets nearly to herself at that hour. She found herself noticing things. The way the light hit the mountains to the east in the early morning, going through gold and then pink, and then a particular pale lavender before becoming the hard blue it would stay all day. The sound of the blacksmith's first hammer strokes. A cat that lived on the roof of the dry goods store and came down every morning for the milk the shopkeeper's daughter put out. She noticed that she was noticing things. This seemed important somehow, though she couldn't articulate why. Thomas had been dead for 11 weeks. She still wore black. She still sealed herself up in the schoolroom on Friday afternoons, but something very small had begun to move in the frozen interior of her. On the third Friday of October, Edgar was in the schoolroom doorway again, this time without flowers, just himself, in his coat and his battered hat, and she realized she had been half expecting him. "You don't need to keep checking on me," she said. "I know," he said, and sat in the chair by the wall, the chair the oldest students used, which was too small for him by about a decade of growth. He sat in it with perfect equanimity, completely unself-conscious. She looked at him. "Why are you really here?" she asked. He considered this with the same honesty she had come to recognize in him, the refusal to give an automatic answer when the true one required more thought. "I'm not sure exactly," he said. "I work a lot, I don't talk to people much. I think I might be practicing." "Practicing what?" "Talking to people." She felt something shift in her chest, not the ache. Something adjacent to the ache but different in quality. "I'm not very good company," she said. "I find you interesting," he said simply. No one had said anything like that to her since Thomas died, and Thomas had been the one saying it. She was not equipped for this, the directness of it, the uncomplicated honesty of a man who apparently meant what he said without ornamentation. "Tell me about the cattle business," she said, because she needed something to do with her hands and her voice. So he told her. He told her about the longhorns and the grass and the winter feeding, and the challenge of keeping water on the range in the dry months. He told her about his father's vision for the operation, and the ways he'd expanded it, and the ways he'd made mistakes. He told her about the 1875 die-off that had taken a quarter of the herd and nearly broken the whole enterprise, and how he'd rebuilt. She listened with her full attention, the same focused quality she brought to everything, and she asked intelligent questions that showed she'd been processing what he said, not just waiting for him to stop. He realized, somewhere in the middle of an explanation of cattle pricing, that this was the longest conversation he'd had that didn't involve work logistics in years, and it felt like stepping into warm water after a long walk in the cold. When it got dark, he stood and said he should be getting back. "Next time," Rosa said, and then stopped as though surprised by her own words. "Next time," he prompted gently, "tell me about the early days, your father's days, when this place was first being built." He smiled then, a full smile, which was rarer on his face than it perhaps should have been, and looked, she thought, like sunshine appearing on a landscape that was dramatic and interesting on its own, but became something else entirely with light on it. "All right," he said. "Next time." He drove home in the dark, and Duke and Mabel knew the road, and he sat in the wagon and looked at the enormous star-packed sky and felt, for the first time in a long time, that the evening was not an ending but a beginning of something. In November, a man arrived in Redemption Creek. His name was Dale Whitmore, and he was a lawyer from Virginia, and Rosa Quinn knew who he was the moment she saw him step off the stage, because he was one of the men who had attended Thomas's funeral, and the sight of him hit her like a cold fist to the sternum. Dale Whitmore had been Thomas's business associate, or had presented himself as such, and Rosa had always been mildly uneasy about him without being able to name why. Now, standing on the boardwalk in the November light in her black dress, watching him scan the street with a flat, assessing expression, she understood the unease had been well-founded. He found her in 3 minutes, which told her he had arrived with purpose. "Mrs. Quinn." He removed his hat with the practiced courtesy of a man who had learned to weaponize manners. "I'm glad to have found you. I've been tasked with the settlement of your late husband's estate." "That was settled in Virginia," she said, "by the estate attorney there. Some matters remained." He smiled. "May we speak privately?" They spoke in Agnes Caldwell's parlor, with Agnes ostensibly sewing in the corner and actually functioning as witness, which Rosa had quietly arranged. What Dale Whitmore wanted was information. Specifically, whether Rosa had found any documents among Thomas's effects that pertained to certain business arrangements. He was careful and oblique about it, but Rosa was intelligent and had been parsing oblique speech since childhood. "I found nothing of relevance to business," she said, which was literally true. The letter she'd found was not a business document. Whitmore smiled again. "You're certain?" "I am. There were letters," he said, and this was the moment she understood the shape of the trap. "That belonged to a client. If they've been mislaid, there could be legal complications." He was looking for the letter, but not for the reason she'd first assumed. As he talked, she began to piece it together. Thomas had not been conducting a straightforward affair. The woman in Charleston was the wife of a business partner, and the letters existed within a context of financial impropriety that Whitmore was now trying to suppress or retrieve. Thomas's involvement had been deeper and darker than a simple betrayal of marriage. He had been part of something that could damage real people. "I burned all correspondence that appeared personal," she said, and watched Whitmore's face shift through several things in quick succession. "All of it. All of it." She met his eyes. "I did not read it carefully. I had just buried my husband." This was not entirely true, but it served the truth, and she felt no guilt about it. After Whitmore left, Agnes Caldwell set down her sewing and looked at Rosa with those quick brown eyes. "That man has a dark past written all over him," Agnes said. "And you just sent him away empty-handed." "I had nothing he was entitled to," Rosa said. "Does Edgar Conroy know a man like that is in town asking questions of you?" "There's no reason Edgar should be involved." Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the placid certainty of a woman who had seen 60 years of human nature, "He'd want to know." Rosa was silent. But that evening when Edgar came to town, which he had taken to doing twice a week now, she told him about Whitmore over coffee in Agnes's parlor. Edgar listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she had come to value most about him, the completeness of his attention. When she finished, he asked 2 precise questions about the nature of the business dealings she'd implied, and then he was quiet for a moment. "He has no legal ground to compel you to produce anything," he said. "The estate was settled. He said so himself." "I know." "Then he's here for another reason." He looked at her steadily. "Is there anything you haven't told me that would help me understand what that reason might be?" This was the moment. She felt it as such. The moment when the hidden thing required a choice. She had carried this secret alone since Thomas died, and it had grown heavier in the carrying, the way secrets do, because they have no weight on their own but borrow it from the person bearing them. She told him. All of it. The letter, the Charleston woman, the financial impropriety she'd pieced together from context, the burning of the letter, the fact that she had no idea who she had actually been married to and whether anything she had believed about her life with Thomas had been real. She told him, and she watched his face, because this was the test she hadn't admitted she was conducting. What he did with this information would tell her what kind of man he was. His face moved through things. Not judgment. Something more careful. Something that looked very much like careful anger on her behalf. And beneath it, something else that she couldn't name yet but recognized at some instinctual level. "I'm sorry," he said. "That's a terrible thing to carry. Not pity, not judgment, just recognition." She felt something break loose inside her, not dramatically, quietly, the way ice goes out on a river in the first warm days, not all at once but in slow separating pieces. "I didn't know who to tell," she said, and was surprised to hear that her voice was rough. "You don't have to tell anyone else," he said. "What that man was and did is not your fault, and it doesn't change who you are. And Whitmore has no legal standing here. If he approaches you again, I'd like to know." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because you're owed some peace," he said, "and I find I have strong feelings about that." Dale Whitmore stayed in Redemption Creek for 4 more days, and found nothing useful and departed on the next southbound stage with the tight expression of a man who had run a trap and found it empty. Edgar had, in those 4 days, arranged to be visible and present in ways that were neither accidental nor threatening, simply the clear, quiet communication of a man whose attention was declared. Whitmore went. The air in Redemption Creek settled back to its ordinary composition. December came in with a cold that had teeth. The children wore their heaviest coats to school, and Rosa brought a second stove from the storage shed and set it up on the boys' side of the room, and taught American history with her coat on and her breath occasionally visible, and noticed that the children had begun to genuinely like her, which she hadn't anticipated and which moved her more than she'd expected. There was a boy named Willie Jessup who had not spoken in school before Rosa arrived, a deep, shy silence that the previous teacher had apparently worked around rather than into. Rosa worked into it with a specific and patient strategy, asking Willie only questions she was confident he knew the answers to, so that when he spoke it was in the voice of competence, not fear. By December he was raising his hand voluntarily, and this, Rosa thought, was what she was here for. This was what made her ribs feel less hollow. Edgar noticed the hollowness receding. He noticed because he was paying attention with the kind of intensity that surprised him when he examined it, which he had begun to do with increasing honesty. He was, he understood, in serious danger of being in love with Rosa Quinn. This was inconvenient for many reasons, primary among them that she was still in the first stage of formal mourning, and she had been betrayed by the man she'd loved, and she was in no position to trust what she might feel, and any decent man would recognize this and proceed with the corresponding caution. So he proceeded with caution. He brought small things. He found reasons to be useful. He talked to her about his father's early days, and she told him about her mother's schoolroom in Virginia, where Rosa had learned to love teaching from watching her mother make it look like the most natural thing in the world. He learned that she had come from a family of modest but educated people, a schoolteacher mother and a minister father who had died before she was grown, that Thomas Quinn had represented both love and practical salvation, and that she could not now disentangle those two things without feeling her judgment was permanently suspect. "You were 22 when you married him?" Edgar asked. 23, she said. "He was 28. He was charming and educated and kind, or so I believed." A pause. "Perhaps he was those things too. Perhaps people are both things simultaneously." "They usually are," Edgar said. "In my experience, people are rarely simply one thing or the other." She looked at him. "What is your dark past, Edgar Conroy?" The question caught him off guard, not because she asked it, but because of how his body responded to his own name in her mouth, a warmth moving through him that had no business being as significant as it was. "A woman," he said. "Her name was Cecilia. We were engaged. She waited approximately 3 months after my father died and then married a banker in Santa Fe. Because you weren't available enough. Because running a cattle operation in a drought requires a man's full attention, and she had requirements that were reasonable and I could not meet them." He said this without particular bitterness. "I don't blame her. But I did spend some time afterward being a fortress." "I see that," Rosa said, not unkindly. "Is it very visible?" "Less than it was," she said, and the way she said it with that measured, careful honesty was more intimate than a declaration would have been. He looked at her across the schoolroom table, in the winter light that came flat and silver through the windows, and he thought that she was the most interesting person he had encountered in years, and that the feeling behind his sternum that had started when he saw her standing alone in the street had grown into something that would require naming eventually. Christmas in Redemption Creek was a community affair organized primarily by Agnes Caldwell and the church women, involving a decorated pine brought in from the higher country, a considerable amount of Agnes's cooking, and the school children performing a nativity that Rosa Quinn directed with the same no-nonsense precision she brought to everything, though she had allowed Willie Jessup to choose his own part, which he'd selected with great seriousness and performed with the focused dignity of a small person doing something that mattered. Edgar came to the performance. He sat in the back with his hat on his knee and watched the children and then watched Rosa watching the children. And the expression on her face in those unguarded moments was the most fully alive he'd seen her look, her dark eyes warm and present, the compressed line of her mouth softened into something that was all the way to joy. He gave her a gift afterward. He'd thought about it for 3 weeks. He'd rejected a dozen options. What he settled on was a small, good-quality ledger book with her name written in the front in his careful block letters. Because she was a woman who kept accounts, who put things in order, who needed a place to record what was real. It was an intimate gift masquerading as a practical one. She held it and looked at the inside cover for a long moment. "How did you know?" she asked. "Know what?" "That I'd lost mine, the one I'd been keeping since Thomas died. The stage passage was rough and the ink bottle broke and ruined it." He hadn't known. He had guessed perhaps at a need beneath the need. "Lucky choice," he said. She looked up at him with those dark amber eyes, and something in them had changed. Something that had been held back had moved forward, just slightly, the way a tide turns, not dramatically but unmistakably. "Thank you, Edgar," she said, his name again in her voice and the warmth again in him spreading. "Merry Christmas, Rosa," he said. Maria had made him bring a tin of her Christmas cookies, which Rosa shared with Agnes Caldwell, and the three of them sat in Agnes's parlor that evening, and Edgar felt the specific, unfamiliar comfort of being in a warm room with people he genuinely liked. And he noticed that Rosa sat with slightly less tension in her shoulders than she usually did, and that when Agnes made a joke about the nativity she laughed, a real laugh, brief and unguarded and musical. And Edgar Conroy filed that sound away in some interior space he didn't examine too closely. January brought real cold and also brought a problem. 3 of Edgar's cattle had been found dead on the western boundary, and the pattern of the wounds and the missing brands suggested something more troubling than natural causes. He rode the western fence for 2 days with Benito and found cut wire in 2 places, carefully repaired afterward but not carefully enough. Someone had been moving cattle in and out across his western boundary, and since his western boundary shared a long stretch with the Alderman grazing land, and the Alderman brothers had a complicated history with the Conroys that predated Edgar's control of the operation. This was not a simple matter. He brought it to the territorial marshal, a blunt, efficient man named Cass Whitfield, who had seen enough range disputes to know they could escalate into something genuinely dangerous. Whitfield agreed to investigate and advised Edgar to keep clear of the aldermans until he had something solid. Edgar kept clear. But he also added a rider to the western boundary rotation and lost sleep over it, and when he came into town that Thursday, he was preoccupied enough that he forgot the coffee Agnes had asked for, which prompted Agnes to look at him with her quick eyes and say, "Sit down and tell me what's wrong." He told her. Agnes listened and said the aldermans had always been trouble and Edgar's father had known it and avoided them with deliberate strategy, and that Cass Whitfield was competent and Edgar should trust the process. He was waiting for Rosa, who had school until 4. She came in at 4:15 with 2 students' essays she was grading while she walked, and she took one look at Edgar's face and set the essays down. "What happened?" she asked. He told her. She listened with that complete attention. "What can I do?" she asked when he finished. He was caught off guard by this, by the directness of it, the simple offer. "Nothing for this," he said. "I appreciate the thought. Are you in danger?" "Not immediate danger," he said. "It's a legal and financial threat more than a physical one. The aldermans are greedy, not violent, but it could take months to resolve and it could cost significantly. Your accounts are in order. I keep decent records," he said. "I keep better ones," she said, with a precision that was not boasting, just fact. "If you need someone to organize documentation for a legal proceeding, I can do that." He looked at her. The offer was genuine and competent, and carried the particular dignity of someone who wanted to be useful in a specific way, not just emotionally supportive. "I might take you up on that," he said. She nodded and picked up her essays, and they said nothing more about it, but something had shifted between them again, another quarter-inch of movement toward something neither of them had named. In February, Rosa Quinn made a decision. She went to the dry goods store on a Thursday morning and bought 2 yards of dark green wool. She returned to Agnes's boarding house and she sat with it on her lap for a while. Then she put it away. Then she took it out again. Then she took the black dress off and folded it carefully and laid it in the bottom of the trunk. She made herself a green dress. It took her 6 evenings of close work by lamplight. Agnes brought her lamp oil without being asked and made no comment. When Rosa put the dress on the following Monday morning, Agnes looked at her across the breakfast table with an expression that had a great deal of tenderness in it. "You look lovely," Agnes said. Rosa Quinn looked down at the green wool and felt the cold air of January morning against arms that had been covered in black for 5 months, and she breathed in carefully and breathed out. She had been Mrs. Thomas Quinn in the black. She was not sure yet what she was in the green. But she walked to school in the thin winter light, and the mountain to the east caught the first gold of morning, and a woman in a green dress walked through a western town in February of 1879, and she was changed by it, or perhaps she was changing and the dress was simply evidence. Edgar saw her on Thursday. He was stopped in the street and she was coming out of the schoolhouse at the end of the day, and she was in green, and the green against the brown and blue of the territorial landscape in February was so vivid and so unexpected that he felt it in his chest like a struck chord. He did not say anything about it immediately. He fell into step beside her on the walk toward Agnes's, and they talked about the alderman situation which Cass Whitfield was making progress on, and about a letter she'd received from the Territorial Education Office praising the school's enrollment numbers. Then he said quietly, "The green suits you." She didn't slow her pace or look at him, but he saw her chin lift a fraction. "I thought it was time," she said. "Past time," he said gently. "But you'll know better than I do when time becomes past time." She looked at him then briefly, and what he saw in her expression was something layered and complicated and moving, and she looked away again before he could name all of it. But he thought the top layer of it was gratitude, and the layer beneath was something warmer, and the layer beneath that was something that scared her slightly, which made sense, which was right, which did not stop him from feeling the corresponding warmth in himself like a steady fire. March came in with wind. The big western wind that moved everything that wasn't nailed down and sent dust through every crack and made the horses bad-tempered and children impossible. Rosa taught arithmetic with the windows rattling in their frames and her voice raised against the weather, and on the worst afternoon she sent the children home early because she could see the sky going yellow-green to the southwest, which was not a color the sky should be. The storm hit at 4 o'clock. A full-scale spring storm with hail that stripped the paint from the Mercantile's sign and lightning that struck the cottonwood at the edge of town and left it split and steaming. Rosa was in the schoolroom waiting it out, which was the safest solid structure near her, when she heard boots on the step and the door opened. Edgar came in bringing the smell of rain and ozone, and his hat was half destroyed by the hail and he was soaked through his coat. "I was in town when it hit," he said. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said. "The roof held." He shook water from his hat and looked at the ceiling, assessing. "Roof held," he confirmed. "Sit down," she said. "Take your coat off, it's wet." He took his coat off and sat in the large chair by the wall, and they listened to the storm do its worst and gradually do less than its worst. And in that hour, Rosa made a pot of coffee on the small stove she'd installed for winter, and they sat in the warm schoolroom, with the rain coming down outside, and talked. They talked with the ease that had been building for months, the ease of two people who had established enough mutual knowledge that conversation could go anywhere without danger. He told her about the worst storms he'd seen on the range, a blizzard in '76 that had killed 40 head and stranded him in the line shack for 3 days, how he'd passed the time by reciting every poem he could remember, which turned out to be more than he'd thought because his mother had been a reader and had insisted on her children's education. "You know poetry," Rosa said with the particular delight of unexpected discovery. Not by choice, he said, but there was a smile in it. By maternal coercion. Tell me one. Absolutely not. Edgar. He had learned in these months to recognize the version of his name she said when she meant it, and this was that version. He recited, somewhat gruffly, the first stanza of Tennyson's Ulysses, which was the one that had come to him most often in the line shack, the one about striving and seeking and not yielding. And when he finished, he felt mildly ridiculous, and she was looking at him with an expression that sent warmth racing up the back of his neck. That's not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? Something about cattle, she said, and the laugh that followed was the laugh he'd stored from Christmas, the unguarded musical one, and he felt it do something significant to his internal architecture. Maria says I'm secretly a romantic, he said, and then stopped because he hadn't planned to say that. Rosa looked at him. The storm had softened to steady rain. The schoolroom smelled of coffee and damp wool and the particular mineral scent of lightning. Maria is perceptive, Rosa said. They looked at each other for a moment too long to be accidental, and then both looked away. And the silence was full of the precise, unbearable sweetness of two people standing at the edge of something. He left when the rain stopped, and she watched him go from the schoolroom doorway. And she stood there for a while after his horse disappeared around the corner. And she thought about Thomas and the green dress and the letter she'd burned, and the specific quality of Edgar Conroy's voice reciting Tennyson in a storm. And she thought that grief was not a straight road, and that healing was not either, and that she had been given, somehow, in this dry and difficult territory, the particular grace of someone whose presence felt like truth. The alderman situation broke open in April. Marshal Whitfield had gathered enough evidence to act, and the action resulted in a confrontation on the alderman property that Edgar was not present for, having been advised strongly to stay away. But that resulted in the arrest of 2 of the 3 alderman brothers on charges of cattle theft and property damage. The third brother, Jed Alderman, who was older and cleverer and had stayed just on the clean side of the evidence, came to Edgar's property on a Tuesday morning with 2 men Edgar didn't know, and the particular dangerous quality of someone who had taken a loss and wanted it felt. Edgar met them at the gate. Benito was behind him and 2 other hands, and the numbers were even, and Edgar was on his own land, and he was not afraid of Jed Alderman, but he was not stupid about it either. Your legal troubles are with the marshal's office, Edgar said. This is not a conversation I'll be having with you. Jed Alderman looked at him with flat, assessing eyes. You cost my family considerably. Your family cost mine first. I kept records of every missing head. The judge will agree. The judge. Jed Alderman said it as though it were a word in a foreign language. Right, he left. He did not make threats, which was almost more troubling, because Jed Alderman was the kind of man whose threats were never verbal. Edgar sent a message to Cass Whitfield. Whitfield rode out the next day, took the information, and said he'd keep an eye on the situation. He also said, with the blunt practicality of a man who had spent 20 years in territorial law enforcement, watch yourself, Conroy. The brothers he can write off. The operation being compromised is the thing he'll hate. Edgar watched himself. He also, that Thursday when he saw Rosa, told her what had happened without softening it. She listened with her full attention, and then she said, You're worried. Reasonably cautious, he said. Worried, she said again, not aggressively, just precisely. He breathed out. Yes, reasonably. Is there anything I can do that isn't organizational work, she asked. He looked at her. She was in a blue dress now, a dark navy blue she'd made the previous month, and she was looking at him with an expression that was asking something larger than the question's literal content. Having somewhere to tell it helps, he said. More than I would have predicted. She held his gaze for a moment. Good, then keep telling it. The spring wore on. The land went green in the way it went green in New Mexico, briefly and brilliantly. The grass coming up between the scrub, the arroyo running with snowmelt, the air carrying the smell of sage and distance. Edgar's cattle moved to the summer range, and the operation expanded into its full seasonal rhythm. and he was busy in the way he was always busy in spring. But he arranged his Thursdays around Redemption Creek the way you arrange something you don't examine too closely, because examining it would require making a decision. Rosa was making her own decisions, quietly and without announcing them. She had begun to sing in the mornings, which Agnes heard through the boarding house walls and noted with deep private satisfaction. She had written a full letter to her sister describing Edgar Conroy, which took 3 drafts because the first 2 were either too careful or not careful enough. She had begun, tentatively, to let herself want things again, not large things, not yet, but small ones. To hear the Tennyson poem again, to know what he thought about something she'd read, to see the particular expression on his face when she said something that surprised him. She was not ready to call it love. But she was aware that the ground had changed, that what had been winter in her had moved towards something that had more light in it. On the last Thursday of April, she asked him to stay for supper at Agnes's, and Agnes made a point of being suddenly very busy with something in the back of the house and staying there. And they ate at the parlor table by the window, with the last of the April evening going gold outside. And Rosa cooked, which turned out to be another thing she was quietly excellent at, and they ate together with the ease of 2 people who have found their rhythm. Afterward she showed him the new ledger which she'd filled with careful entries in her precise, elegant script, a personal account she'd been keeping since January, not financial but observational, things she'd noticed and wanted to preserve. She showed him a section she'd written about the mountains in morning light. He read it slowly and carefully, and she watched his face and saw that he found it exactly as significant as it was. "You should write more of this," he said. "I will," she said. "I am." He looked up at her across the ledger. "Rosa," she waited. "I'm going to say something that I've been working up to for approximately 4 months," he said, with the direct, slightly rueful honesty she loved about him. "I want to be clear about my intent so that you can do whatever you need to do with it." She kept her hands very still on the table. "I have strong feelings for you," he said. "I have had them for some time. I'm not asking you to feel the same or to feel anything before you're ready. I'm telling you because you deserve to know what's here, from an honest man, in plain terms. Whatever you want to do with that information is entirely yours to decide." The evening light came through the window and lay across the table between them, and Rosa Quinn sat in it and thought about truth and about the specific, unfamiliar miracle of a man whose way of loving looked like honesty. "I know," she said quietly. "I've known for a while." And he was very still. "And I'm not entirely ready," she said, "but I'm not afraid of it, which is different from where I was in September." A pause. "I would like you to be patient." "I'm a cattleman," he said. "Patience is a professional requirement." This time the laugh was not brief. It lasted long enough for her to press her hand over her mouth to contain it, and it made her eyes go bright. And Edgar Conroy looked at her in the evening light of April 1879 and understood that he would wait as long as necessary. May brought Rosa a piece of news that she had not anticipated. A letter arrived from Virginia, from a solicitor. It informed her that Thomas Quinn's estate, which had appeared to be deeply in debt at the time of his death, had in fact contained a concealed account that the estate attorneys had discovered in the course of the fraud investigation that had apparently resulted from the same impropriety Dale Whitmore had been sent to suppress. The investigation had uncovered Thomas's role in the scheme, and as part of the legal settlement, a portion of the recovered funds had been directed to Rosa Quinn as Thomas Quinn's surviving spouse, since the estate's debts had been largely fraudulently manufactured to hide assets. It was not a fortune, but it was enough. It was enough to be independent. It was enough to stop being afraid of the future in the specific, practical way she had been afraid of it. She sat with the letter at Agnes's kitchen table for a long time. She thought about Thomas, the real Thomas, the layered and complicated person who had been both the man she loved and the man she hadn't known, and she felt grief for him that was also anger and also pity and also the complicated residue of something real, because she had loved him, And what had been real in that love did not unreal itself just because other things were also true. She thought about the green dress. She thought about the ledger. She thought about April evenings and the particular grace of an honest man. She wrote back to the solicitor with careful instructions about the funds. Then she walked to the schoolhouse where her children were waiting, and she taught them history, and she felt the ground beneath her feet firm and real and hers. She told Edgar about the letter that Thursday. He listened. He asked two careful questions. Then he said, "How are you feeling about it?" "Like I've been released from something," she said. "And like the release is complicated because the thing I was released from was also something I built my life around." "That sounds accurate," he said. "I'm going to be all right," she said. And it was not a reassurance. It was a statement of demonstrated fact. "I know," he said. And the way he said it, with the easy certainty of someone who had watched her be all right in harder circumstances than this, made her chest ache with something that was not grief. The summer of 1879 was hot and dry, which was the ordinary course of things in New Mexico, and Rosa taught summer sessions 3 days a week for the children who wanted them, which turned out to be 7 of the 11, including Willie Jessup, who came every session without fail and had become, in Rosa's private assessment, one of the keenest minds she'd taught. Edgar brought the hay in and managed the water situation and dealt with a case of fever in the herd that cost him 8 head and a great deal of sleep. And on a Thursday in July, when Rosa met him at the usual time, she saw immediately that he had not slept properly in days. "Sit down," she said, in the tone that brooked no argument. He sat. She made him coffee and sat across from him and said, "Tell me all of it," and he did. And the telling took the tight line out of his shoulders the way release valves work. And when he'd said everything, he looked up at her, and she was watching him with the particular warm, focused attention she brought to things that mattered. And he thought, not for the first time, that being known by this woman was the most valuable thing that had happened to him in years. "What are you going to do about the water situation?" she asked. "I've been in correspondence with a fellow up in Colorado who's done well with windmill irrigation," he said. "It would be an investment, but it would solve the dry month problem structurally." "Then do it," she said, with the clean decisiveness of someone who had looked at the facts and reached a conclusion. "The investment is sound. How do you know?" "Because you've described the economics of your operation to me over the course of 10 months and I have been paying attention," she said. "Your margins can support it. The risk is manageable." He looked at her. She was in a pale yellow dress today, the third she'd made for herself, and she was looking at him with an expression of calm certainty, and he thought, suddenly and with great clarity, that this was the person he wanted to have this conversation with for the rest of his life. "Rosa," he said. She recognized the tone. She went very still. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know that there is no pressure in the asking. You can say no, and everything continues exactly as it has been, because what we have as it is has more value to me than anything I'd risk by asking. But I've thought about it carefully, and I believe that not asking would be dishonest, and you know how I feel about honesty." "Ask," she said quietly. "Would you consider marrying me?" The summer air held them. Through the schoolroom window, the sky was the absolute blue of New Mexico in July, infinite and certain. Rosa Quinn looked at Edgar Conroy across the schoolroom table and thought about every morning she'd walked to school in this territory, and the light that hit the mountains, and the green dress, and the yellow flowers from Maria and Tennyson in a storm, and the ledger with her name in block letters, and a man who told her the truth in plain terms because he believed she was owed it. She thought about the black dress folded at the bottom of the trunk. She thought about color. "Yes," she said, "I will." He breathed out, a long, released breath, and reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him. And his hand was calloused and warm and steady, and she curled her fingers into it, and they sat like that for a while, with the summer outside and the schoolroom quiet, and the particular luminous quality of a moment that is both an ending and a beginning. They were married in September of 1879, exactly 1 year after Rosa had arrived in Redemption Creek with her black dress and her silence and her leather trunk. The ceremony was in the small adobe church, and Agnes Caldwell cried openly and with considerable dignity, and Maria wore her best dress and made enough food for the entire town, which she then served to the entire town, because Maria's expression of love operated at civic scale. Hiram Foster shook Edgar's hand and told him he'd made a sound decision in hiring Mrs. Quinn as the school teacher, which was Hiram's version of a romantic sentiment, and everyone understood it as such. Willie Jessup was in attendance with his mother, and he shook Rosa's hand with great seriousness and told her he planned to attend the Territorial University in Albuquerque when he was old enough, which Rosa told him she had no doubt he would. Rosa wore a dress she had made herself from the blue fabric Edgar had bought that first fall, the length he'd brought home and left on Maria's table without examining why. It had been in her chest for months. She'd waited for the right occasion. She understood, putting it on that September morning, that she had been making it for this without knowing it. Edgar saw her in it and stopped moving entirely for a moment, just looked at her standing in the church doorway with the September light behind her and her dark hair pinned loosely, and the blue of the dress the color of the sky he'd been riding under all his life. "Hello," he said, which was not what anyone says at their wedding but was the most honest thing in him at that moment. "Hello," she said, and smiled at him. A full smile, nothing held back, and it was the most beautiful thing he'd seen in his life. They said their vows with the gravity of two people who understood what promises cost and what they were worth. Edgar's voice was steady and sure. Rosa's voice did not shake. They looked at each other throughout because this was not a performance, it was a statement of fact, and facts deserve direct witnesses. Afterward, walking out of the church into the September sunshine as husband and wife, Rosa Quinn felt something happen in her chest that she had not felt in so long she hadn't been sure she still could feel it. Uncomplicated joy. Just joy, clean and bright and without the shadow of grief or betrayal or secret or fear. Just joy. The simplest, most extraordinary thing. They went to live at the Conroy Ranch, where Maria had cleaned the house from top to bottom and put wildflowers in every room, and Rosa stood in the large, drafty, ambitious main house and saw immediately what it needed and what she could do with it, and felt the satisfaction of a person who has found the right problem to solve. She kept teaching. The school board raised no objection, because Hiram Foster was a practical man and good teachers were not plentiful, and Rosa's record with the town's children was by that point undeniable. She drove the 6 miles to town 3 days a week in the small buggy Edgar bought her, and on the other days she sat at the desk she had established in what had been the back room, and kept the ranch accounts with the precision and clarity that had been making Edgar look at ledgers with something approaching emotion ever since she'd taken them over. The windmill irrigation system arrived from Colorado in pieces and took 3 weeks to assemble, and revolutionized the ranch's water situation in the way Rosa had calmly predicted it would. "You were right," Edgar said, looking at the working windmill with the satisfaction of a man who has solved a problem structurally. "I generally am," Rosa said, with the specific warmth she'd learned to put into the things that might otherwise sound too sharp, so that they became instead a private language between them. He looked at her sideways and smiled, and she bumped her shoulder against his arm, and above them the windmill turned in the dry wind against the blue sky, doing its work. In the winter of 1879, Cass Whitfield closed the Alderman case. The 2 brothers received sentences and were transferred to the territorial prison. Jed Alderman, who had remained legally clean, sold his grazing rights and left the territory, which was the cleanest resolution possible and the one Edgar had most hoped for. Edgar received compensation for the stolen cattle and put it toward the irrigation expansion. On a cold February evening, sitting by the fire in the main house with the wind doing its work outside, Rosa told Edgar she was expecting a child. He was very still for a moment. Then he turned from the fire and looked at her, and what was in his face was something that she would think about for the rest of her life, the specific quality of a man confronted with the most profound good news he's ever received. "Rosa," he said. "September," she said. "Maria already knows. I told her this morning and she burst into Spanish and made 3 extra things for supper. Maria has been waiting for this longer than I have," he said, with a warmth in his voice that made her laugh. He crossed to where she was sitting and crouched beside the chair and took her hands in his and looked at her with those steady eyes, and she thought about a woman in a black dress standing in a street with a leather trunk at her feet, and how far that woman was from this room and this fire and these hands. "Are you happy?" he asked, because he always asked the real question. "Completely," she said, and it was true in the way only the simplest things are true, entirely and without qualification. Their son was born on a hot September morning in 1880, delivered by the town's doctor with Agnes Caldwell present as an entirely unofficial but absolutely indispensable additional presence. He was a healthy, loud, considerably opinionated infant who made his objections to the world known immediately and at volume. They named him James Thomas Conroy. James for Edgar's father, and Thomas because Rosa had decided, in the long process of working through what Thomas Quinn had been and had not been, that the real love she'd carried for him deserved acknowledgement even if the man himself had been more complicated than she'd known. It was an act of grace, naming the boy Thomas, and Edgar understood it as such and had agreed without hesitation. James Thomas Conroy turned out to be a child of emphatic opinions, great energy, and a laugh that sounded improbably like his mother's, and that made Maria do a little involuntary dance whenever it happened, which happened often. Willie Jessup came to see the baby with his mother, very serious in his good shirt, and held the infant for approximately 2 minutes with the concentration of someone performing brain surgery, and then carefully returned him to Rosa and said, "He seems intelligent," which Rosa accepted with the gravity it deserved. The ranch continued. The school continued. The seasons turned over each other in the way they do in New Mexico, the springs brilliant and brief, the summers long and demanding, the falls golden and exact, the winters cold and star-packed and quiet. Rosa had begun writing in earnest, not just in the ledger but longer work, observations and accounts of the territory and the people in it, the kind of writing that was not quite journalism and not quite memoir but something between, the voice of someone paying full attention to the world they were inside. She sent several pieces to the Albuquerque newspaper, which published them, and to a periodical in Denver, which asked for more. Edgar read everything she wrote. He read it carefully, the way he read everything, and his responses were specific and honest, and frequently the most useful she received. "This paragraph is doing 2 things at once," he said one evening, setting the pages down. "The second thing is more interesting. Start with the second thing." She looked at the paragraph. He was right. He was frequently right about her writing in a way that initially surprised her and then didn't, because he was a man who thought clearly and said what he thought, and that turned out to be exactly what a writer needed. In the spring of 1882, Rosa discovered she was expecting again. This second pregnancy was easier in some ways, harder in others, complicated by the fact that James was by then 18 months old, and in possession of a will that could have driven cattle and occasionally needed to be redirected with the firmness Edgar brought to difficult longhorns, which he found deeply funny, and she found both funny and exhausting in equal measure. Their daughter arrived in October of 1882 and was called Alice after Rosa's mother, with Agnes as her middle name, because Agnes Caldwell had been the first person to offer Rosa refuge, and the fact of it deserved permanence. Alice Agnes Conroy was not the emphatic personality her brother was. She was quieter, watchful, with her father's habit of waiting until she had something worth saying before she said it, and Rosa looked at her daughter sometimes with the specific emotion of recognizing yourself in a face that is not your own. Agnes Caldwell held the baby and cried again, with the same dignity she'd brought to Edgar and Rosa's wedding, and told Rosa in a low voice that she was the best thing that had happened to this corner of New Mexico since the Conroys first arrived. And Rosa held the old woman's hand and said, "You are the first kindness I received here. I have not forgotten it." The boarding house in town changed hands eventually, as things do. Agnes's health had begun to require less winter cold and more warmth, and she had a daughter in Tucson who wanted her mother near. And so she left on a September morning in 1883 with Rosa and Edgar at the stage to see her off. And Rosa held her for a long time, this woman who had met her at the edge of her worst darkness and fed her coffee and made room for her, and said goodbye with the particular gratitude that goes too deep for ordinary speech. Maria remained. Maria would always remain, was the general operating assumption, because Maria was as much a part of the Conroy ranch as the main house and the windmill, and the draw to the south where the cattle watered in the evenings. She had taken James and Alice's arrivals as personal achievements and invested in their upbringing with the comprehensive thoroughness she brought to all her enterprises. James, at 4, was already attempting to help his father with the horses and had developed opinions about which horses were trustworthy and which required management that Edgar found to be largely accurate. He listened to James's assessments with the same seriousness he brought to the adults in his life, which James received as his due, and which Edgar privately thought might be the best thing he could offer a child, to be taken seriously. Alice, at 2, had identified Maria as her principal authority and operated accordingly, which Maria found completely appropriate and Edgar and Rosa found both amusing and slightly concerning. On a summer evening in 1883, Edgar and Rosa sat on the porch of the main house after the children were in bed and Maria had retired, and the sky was doing what the New Mexico sky does in summer, which is to produce a quantity of stars that strikes Eastern visitors as somehow excessive. And Edgar had his arm around Rosa, and she had her head against his shoulder, and they were quiet in the easy way of people who have nothing to hide from each other. "Tell me something," Rosa said. "What sort of thing?" "Something you haven't told me yet." He was quiet for a moment, considering. "When you walked into the schoolroom in the green dress for the first time," he said, "I was waiting outside the window. I'd been in town since noon and I kept finding reasons not to leave, and I didn't understand why until I saw you through the window in the green dress and I thought, there it is. That's what I've been waiting for." She was very still against his shoulder. "You never told me that," she said. It seemed like the kind of thing that required the right moment. She looked up at him and the stars were reflecting in her dark eyes, and he thought, not for the first time, that this woman was the most fully alive person he'd ever known, that she occupied her own life with a completeness that was its own kind of grace. "I looked at those yellow flowers for a long time the first time you brought them," she said. "The ones from Maria. I put them on the windowsill and I stood there and I thought, yellow is a color I had forgotten existed." He turned to look at her. "That was the beginning," she said simply. He pressed his lips to her temple slowly and with intent. "The beginning of what?" he asked against her hair. "Of being here," she said. "Of being present in my own life again." The color came back slowly, one small thing at a time, and most of those things were you. He held her tighter, and the summer night held them both, and the cattle were settled on the range and the children were sleeping and Maria's lamp had gone out, and the stars burned above the territorial landscape in their ancient and excessive abundance. "I love you," he said, which he said every day but which retained, every time, the quality of the first time, because he said it with the same direct honesty he brought to everything, not as a habit but as a fact being stated. "I love you," she said, and leaned into him, and they sat in the dark and the starlight and the quiet, which was not the quiet of absence or loss or hollowness, but the quiet of fullness, of two people so entirely settled in each other's presence that silence was not empty, but simply the space between words when the thing being said was too large for them. Willie Jessup went to the Territorial University in the fall of 1884, 18 years old and serious-faced, and carrying a letter of recommendation from Rosa Conroy that he read 3 times on the stage, folded carefully, and kept in his breast pocket for the entire journey. He sent Rosa a letter when he arrived, describing the library in terms that suggested he considered it a kind of heaven, and she read it aloud to Edgar at the supper table, and they both looked satisfied in the deep way of people who have been part of something good. In the years that followed, the Conroy Ranch grew with the measured, patient strategy that was Edgar's way of doing everything. He did not overextend. He made sound investments and let them mature. He hired carefully and kept his hands long, including Benito, who had been with him since before Rosa arrived, and who eventually married the blacksmith's daughter and built a small house on the southern edge of the Conroy land with Edgar's blessing, and a formal arrangement that gave both families exactly what they needed. Rosa continued to write and continued to teach until James was old enough for school, at which point she hired her replacement herself and conducted the interview, and reported to Hiram Foster with the firm opinion that a young woman named Helen Marsh was exactly what the school needed. Hiram Foster, who had by this point learned that Rosa Conroy's firm opinions were worth acting on, hired Helen Marsh, who turned out to be excellent. Rosa's writing began to find a larger audience. A collection of her territory pieces was gathered by a Denver publisher in 1885 and printed in a modest edition that sold better than expected and generated correspondence from readers in 3 states. Edgar read the reviews with the particular satisfaction of a man whose assessment of a person has been publicly confirmed. "I told you 4 years ago you should write more of this," he said. "You told me one paragraph was doing 2 things," she said. "Both statements are true and both make the same point." She threw a dish towel at him, which he caught, which he found funny, which she also found funny, though she maintained her expression of dignity for approximately 4 seconds before abandoning it. James Conroy, at 5, asked his father one morning why the 2 men who sometimes came to the northern fence line looked different from the ranch hands, and Edgar sat with his son on the fence rail and explained, carefully and in terms a 5-year-old could hold, that the land they lived on had belonged to other people before them, that the Apache and the Comanche and many others had lived in this territory for generations, that the history of how it had changed hands was long and complicated and not always fair, and that fairness was something worth caring about even when it was difficult. James considered this with the concentration he brought to important things. "Are they angry?" he asked. "Sometimes," Edgar said. "Sometimes with reason." "What should we do?" "Treat people with respect," Edgar said. "Be fair in your dealings. Use only what's yours. Those things don't solve everything, but they're the right place to start." James nodded as though accepting a task. Rosa, who had been listening from the garden side of the fence, looked at her husband and thought, not for the first time, that she had married a man worth the name. Alice grew up with her mother's precision and her father's patience, an unusual combination that made her a formidable child and would make her an extraordinary adult. By 8 she was reading everything she could find in the house, which was a great deal, because Rosa had systematically built a library in the back room that was one of the better private collections in the territory. By 10 she was writing, carefully, and with an instinct for language that made Rosa put the pages down and take a breath before responding. "You have your mother's eye," Edgar told Alice one evening when she showed him a short piece she'd written about the mountains. Alice looked at this information with her characteristic calm assessment. "Is that good?" "It's exceptional," he said, "and I am not a man who uses that word carelessly." The house filled with the particular music of a life built intentionally. Maria's cooking and James's arguments with the horses and Alice's careful, deliberate observations, and Rosa at her desk in the long afternoon light, and Edgar coming in from the range with the smell of cattle and sun and open land on him, and the fire in winter and the porch in summer and the stars always above the territorial landscape in their ancient generosity. In the summer of 1886, Rosa took both children to Virginia to meet her sister, Margaret, who had been corresponding with Rosa since the early days in Redemption Creek, and had formed her own strong impression of Edgar Conroy from Rosa's letters. Margaret greeted Rosa at the Richmond station with an embrace that lasted considerably longer than a usual greeting, and then held her back by the shoulders and looked at her. "You look different," Margaret said. "Older," Rosa said. "No, something else." Margaret looked at the children who were surveying Virginia with the calm territorial assessment of children who had grown up in large landscape. Then she looked back at Rosa. "You look like yourself, more like yourself than I can remember." Rosa thought about this on the train home, the children sleeping against each other in the seat across from her, the landscape going from green Virginia to the flatter plains of the West, and she thought about a woman arriving in a strange territory in a black dress with no color left, and a year of small kindnesses that had been, she understood now, a careful and patient form of love. She wrote in the new ledger, which was the 7th she'd filled since Edgar had given her the first one, and she wrote about color. About how it comes back not all at once but in increments, a yellow flower on a windowsill, a green dress, a blue length of fabric, a man who brought his whole honest self to every conversation and asked for nothing in return and was patient beyond what patience usually means. Patient not as an absence of urgency, but as the active, generous choice to let someone come to themselves in their own time. She wrote it, and she thought it was probably the best thing she'd written, and she was not wrong. Edgar was at the Redemption Creek station when she arrived back, hat in hand, with Benito holding the wagon horses. He looked up when the train slowed and found her face in the window before the train had fully stopped, which was the kind of finding that requires knowing exactly who you're looking for. He helped the children down and then held his hands up for Rosa, and she took them and stepped down from the train car, and he kept holding them after she was down, and she looked at him in the New Mexico September light, the same month she had first arrived, the same dry heat and blue sky and enormous landscape, and she thought, "Here. This is where, this is who." "Good trip?" he asked. "Very good. Margaret sends you her permanent affection. Smart woman, your sister. She said you sounded insufferably decent in my letters." "She's not wrong," he said, and she laughed and stepped into him, and he put his arms around her, and the children descended on them both from the sides with the determined enthusiasm of children who have been in transit for 3 days and require parental reattachment. They drove home in the wagon in the September afternoon, James asking questions about train mechanisms and Alice making observations about the landscape with the attentive precision that had characterized her since she could talk. And Maria met them at the house with food and noise, and the complete, comprehensive warmth of a woman who had watched this family become itself and considered it her finest work. That evening, after the children were in bed and Maria had gone to her room, and the house settled into its nighttime rhythms, Edgar and Rosa sat on the porch again, the summer stars beginning to appear in the darkening east. "Tell me about Virginia," he said. So she told him all of it, her sister's face and the green of it, so different from New Mexico green, and the graves she'd visited, her parents and Thomas, because she'd gone to Thomas's grave and stood there for a long time with the complicated feelings that had, over 7 years, resolved themselves into something she could hold without being destroyed by it. A sadness for what was and what wasn't, and the specific irreversibility of death, and gratitude, strange and genuine, for the life that had come after. "Are you at peace with it?" Edgar asked, not pressing, just asking the real question. "I am," she said, and this was true. The way things can be true after years of working toward them, not sudden peace, but the peace that comes from having done the work, from having earned the ground beneath your feet. He took her hand in the dark. "I love you, Rosa," he said. "I love you, Edgar," she said. The stars continued their work above them. The cattle were settled on the range. The windmill turned in the night wind. The children slept in the big house that was no longer drafty because Rosa had made a systematic project of it, and now it was tight and warm and full. In the distance, Redemption Creek's lights were small and bright against the dark, and the mountains were black shapes against a sky that was, as always, more than you could take in at once, requiring you to look at it in pieces slowly, which was perhaps the right way to look at anything that mattered. This was the life Rosa Quinn had built from the rubble of one that had collapsed beneath her, built with her own hands and her own will and the particular grace of a man who had seen a woman standing alone in a street with all the color gone out of her and had walked across the road without quite deciding to, and had given her, one small kindness at a time, the raw materials she'd needed to build it. She had arrived in Mourning and he had given her color back. Not all at once, not dramatically. But the way good things come, gradually and surely, in yellow flowers on a schoolroom windowsill, and an honest voice reciting Tennyson in a storm and a ledger book with her name in block letters and years of Thursday conversations that turned into a life. She had arrived in Mourning, and she had been saved not by rescue but by presence, by someone who showed up and kept showing up and offered his honest self without condition and waited, patiently, for her to find her own way back to herself. The color had come back, all of it, every shade. She was not the woman who had stepped off that stage in September of 1878, and she was not only the woman who had stepped off that stage, because that woman was also her, and what had been true in the grief was true in the joy, and what was true in the grief had been transformed into the substance of a life, more fully felt than anything she'd known before. She sat on the porch of her house in the New Mexico night with her husband's hand in hers and the stars above them and the land around them and the children sleeping inside, and all of it was real, every color of it, and she was in it, fully present in her own life, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.